The situation is dismal. It's going to get worse. We're going to have price inflation. They've been destroying energy production. They've been destroying agricultural production. They're preparing famines. And I know that might also sound far-fetched, but they have been, the Imperial Guard has been using famine as a weapon against their own population for centuries.
Hello everyone and welcome to another edition of Triangle Investor Interviews. I'm your host Lucian Valkovic, and before I announce my guest, just a quick reminder of a disclaimer. This interview and all my interviews are not a recommendation to buy any shares, products or services. Always do your due diligence and consult with your financial advisor. And my guest today is Alex Krainer, a founder of Krainer Analytics and creator of ICE System Trading Following. He has worked as a market analyst, researcher, trader. He's a known name in the space. So Sasha, Alex, welcome back.
Thank you for the invite, Lucian, and always good to be with you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have a lot of things to discuss. A lot of topics is in my head. However, let's start with the broader geopolitical topic and global power shifts. You have discussed the acceleration of decline of Western influence and the rise of BRICS nations. What are the key geopolitical shifts that you are seeing shaping in this year, and how irreversible are those changes?
Well, I think by far the biggest thing going on is the beginning of the end of 5 centuries of Eurocentric world order. So pretty much for the last 5 centuries, maybe a bit more, the center of gravity of global development, center of political and financial and military power of the world have been European countries. And this is the world that we have been born into. This is the normal that we all got accustomed to, and that we all probably more or less came to think of as permanent. But this is now unraveling. This unraveling is accelerating, and the center of gravity is shifting to the east. And I think that it's shifting to India and China, but by extension to the new global architecture that entails multipolar integrations. And Europe is losing, not only is Europe losing relevance, it's being pushed to the periphery. And that struck me when, when we had, 2 weeks ago, we had the summit in Alaska between Trump and Vladimir Putin. That wasn't even 2 weeks ago, that was like 10 days ago, no? And it feels like it was last year. So much stuff is happening. So one of the big projects that has been discussed since the 1860s has been connecting the United States and Russia, and by extension the American continent and the Asian continent, through the Bering Strait. So from Chukotka Peninsula to Alaska, by drilling a tunnel in between. Which may seem like, people say a bridge to nowhere, a tunnel to nowhere. But it isn't really, because it's merely a catalyst. It's a catalyst for future economic development. You have to lay down the infrastructure first. But it's also very symbolic, and it was often regarded in this way because it's a physical connection between Russia and the United States. And then, if you look at the map of the world, maybe a little bit from the northern perspective, from if you look at the North Pole as the center of the map, and you see that you have southward, you have China, Japan, India, which are these massive economic powers, nearly 3 billion population, and then the connection towards the Americas, and all the way on the periphery there's Europe. Then you see that if these integrations progress, if they continue to develop and be cultivated, then Europe is really pushed out to the periphery. And I think that this is part of the reason why you have such visceral reaction, why leading European powers like Britain, France, and Germany are absolutely hysterical about the changes happening in the world, and why they want to derail the positive development of relations between Russia and the United States by all means necessary. And this is, kind of what defines practically current events on the let's say on the European continent.
Yeah, good point, Sasha. Let's talk a bit about Ukraine-Russian potential peace. How do you see it? How do you see the next steps on both sides, on the European side? How do you see geopolitical games evolving over here?
Well, Project Ukraine has capsized. It's finished. Russia won. Western powers lost, and the Europeans are stuck holding the bag. And by holding the bag, I mean it's they bet the ranch on this project, and they lost. And now it's panic time because they invested hundreds of billions of dollars in Ukraine. Probably a lot more than we know. The figures that they declare and the figures that are real are not the same. And they've done so counting on being able to destabilize Russia, to regime change it, to partition it, and to plunder and loot Russian wealth. That hasn't happened. They froze some $300 billion of Russian financial assets in the West, and it's clear from the statements of European leaders that they were counting on using those assets, particularly as collateral to fuel a new large-scale credit cycle in Europe to, increase employment, GDP growth, business, and now I think this is in jeopardy, and I think that this is the immediate cause of their panic, because one thing that I think is inevitable now is that Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin are going to come to certain agreements. We don't know a whole lot about them because much of these discussions are going behind closed doors. They're secret. But one thing that we can say is predictable about Donald Trump is that wherever he goes, he's selling the United States. He's trying to pitch investments. He's trying to kind of coerce statesmen and leaders around the world to make large-scale investments in the United States. So when he went to Middle Eastern countries like Saudi Arabia and UAE, he got hundreds of billions of dollars commitments to invest in the United States. When he summoned Ursula von der Leyen to his golf course in Scotland, he got her to commit $600 billion of European investments in the United States. And I am pretty sure that he will not resist trying to pitch the same to Vladimir Putin if he hasn't already done so. And so he could easily make this deal irresistible for Putin, because he could say, well, look, if you invest these assets, I'm talking about the $300 billion of frozen Russian assets, if you invest this in the United States, we will be able to maybe unfreeze them, to relax some sanctions, and so on and so forth. And for the Russians, the deal would make perfect sense because it would defund the Europeans, who are now the main source of threat to Russia. You know, they are the most rabid warmongers, instigators of crises and instabilities and you know, continuing arming of Ukraine and so forth. So I think that Vladimir Putin will think like, well, yeah, that makes perfect sense. Let's do that. And one day we'll probably learn, and probably not in a very distant future, that the Russians gave the order to European powers to transfer those assets to the United States, to New York, to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. So we have about, I think, about 180 or so billion dollars in Belgium in Euroclear. There are supposedly $70 billion in France, about $37 billion in the UK, another, I don't know how much in Canada, about 25 billion or so, and only about $5 to $8 billion in the United States. So at that point, you know, Donald Trump can say, yes, this has been agreed, and European leaders, please comply, or else. And these, you know, these people will have no other recourse but to comply. And I think that that will be a very catastrophic blow financially to the EU and to individual European powers like France, Belgium, Germany, UK, and Canada. And you know, if we paid attention to events, you can see that Trump does treat the Europeans with a certain contempt and disdain. And I think that, you know, in the same deal, he gets to have $300 billion of Russian assets, and he gets to deliver a humiliating kick to the Europeans. I don't see him resisting this temptation. So I believe that this is coming. And so it will leave the Europeans in the lurch, in a very bad position. Now, to come full circle in answering your question, the Europeans now want to continue the war by themselves. They are, you know, they are committed to Ukraine. They don't want to let it go. They can't let go of Project Ukraine. This, you know, this is like the typical gambler's ruin. You know, you gambled at a table and you gambled and you kept losing. And then instead of walking away with at least some money, some value intact, you reckon, well, I'll gamble a little bit more. Maybe I'll be able to make up some losses now. I'll gamble even more. And so this is a typical thing where you end up losing everything because you didn't accept a partial loss. You couldn't accept defeat. And so this is coming for Europe, and they want to continue. They're talking about going to war with Russia in 2028, 2029. In order for them to do that, they need the war in Ukraine to continue until that time, because, you know, it's easier to join an ongoing war than to contrive a brand new war out of thin air. Again, you have to invent, a pretext, you have to invent justifications, you have to create the whole situation for it's complicated. So it would be better if the Ukrainians continued to fight and die until the Europeans get ready, which they think will be by 2029, and then they want to join. However, I think that this is largely wishful thinking. They don't have the weapons, they don't have the troops, and they don't have public support. So for all of their psyops, for all of their fear-mongering, for all of their demonization of Russia, I think that the people in Europe are not quite buying it. And I think that what's going to happen in the end is that all these leaders, Macron, Starmer, Merz, they're going to fall, and there might even be revolutions and civil wars, particularly in places like France and the UK.
Yeah, let's Let's talk about global economics and financial systems, but sticking with Europe. You warned about the potential financial crash in Europe due to multiple reasons. What specific economic indicators should investors watch for in European markets in the coming months, especially in the light of what we are talking here?
Well, I would say look at the bond markets. Look at the gilts in the UK and look at the euro bonds, and I think that they will tell you the story, because the statistical aggregates that they publish and that they give us are largely distorted to conceal the catastrophic fiscal and monetary situation in Europe and in the UK. And, by the way, in Japan as well. But the bond markets, are registering all this in a way that's indirect, but like it reflects. I've been a professional in financial markets for about 30 years now, and there is a thing called a collective wisdom of the markets, and it doesn't register events in real time. It acts more like a blob, but the blob with a delay and slowly and inertly does react to true rendition of events, right? And so I actually started writing about this about 2021, and the reason was that when the United States announced that they were withdrawing from Afghanistan, that was in August of 2021, so just about 4 years ago, I noticed that the reaction to this in the UK was completely hysterical. I was taken aback because I thought, surely the junior partner in this misadventure should be relieved that they could now pull out their troops from Afghanistan and finish that episode. Because the British always try to give you an impression that they're just being a loyal junior partner to the United States, that they follow along and they get into all these troubles because, the Americans are creating them. So in that case, the Brits should be relieved that the story in Afghanistan has closed. Instead, it was completely over-the-top hysterical, and I thought, like, what is this all about? And then I kind of started looking into it, and then I realized that the role of the British and the extent to which they are invested in all these imperial wars is hidden, and it's much, much larger than we know. And then I started following the story, and I realized that Britain is in a horrible position, and they are way invested in these imperial wars, particularly now Ukraine and Israel, and they're losing on all fronts. And so they are how do you call it? They're in a dying agony, and practically, if you watch the prices of bonds of the British gilt, of even U.S. Treasuries and the Euro bonds, and you draw a vertical line from the date when the United States withdraws from Afghanistan, you get a very, very sharp downtrend. And that period, the British bonds fell by practically 50%. And that period is, in the financial markets, people are referring to it as the bonds Armageddon, because it was the largest drop in bond prices since the beginning of records, since something like 240 years. And it's continuing because, now the bond prices have stabilized a little bit since 2022. I guess since the beginning of the special military operation in Ukraine. But they are, every time they try to bounce back a little bit, the markets beat them back down. And there's less and less buying pressure to reverse this trend. And I think that what's going to happen is that it's going to break through these support lines, because what you have now is kind of like a support lines where the bond prices kind of bouncing in a narrower and narrower band along this horizontal support line. And I think at some point they're going to break below. And then, there's no support anymore. And I think that what we might get is a massive downtrend, a massive bear market. And I think that the European and British bonds and possibly the Japanese government bonds are going to go essentially to zero. I know it's hard to imagine this, but if you look at historical precedents, it tends to happen, and especially tends to happen when empires unravel. Their debt becomes worthless, and so the debt of the European Union and of the British Empire, which is still a thing, contrary to what people believe, is probably going to become worthless.
Yeah, I want to pick your brain on the digitalization of the euro and how big red flag is this, Alex? The European Union is advancing toward the digital euro and greater financial centralization under the European Central Bank. So I want to really hear your take on this. What are the implications of this shift for national sovereignty and individual financial freedom?
Well, it couldn't be worse.
Exactly.
It's a creation of a digital gulag where, this is all born out of the need to control the domestic populations. Because the situation is dismal, it's going to get worse. We're going to have price inflation. They've been destroying energy production. They've been destroying agricultural production. They're preparing famines. And I know that might also sound far-fetched, but they have been, the Imperial Guard has been using famine as a weapon against their own population for centuries. What they call Irish potato famine, which is now, being portrayed as an accident. The potato blight came out of nowhere, and the Irish people were eating potatoes. That's it. That's all they grew. That's all they ate. And so when the potato crops went, then 2 million Irish people starved to death. That story doesn't hold water at all. And we also have, during the colonial times in in India, when the British were in charge, over a period of about 130 years, there were 33 major famines registered in India. There have been none since the British left India. Okay? So I know that correlation isn't causation, but they do this, and therefore people should be very, very concerned about this systematic destruction of agricultural production that we see in Croatia, in Britain, in Holland, in Germany, in Canada. Non-stop pressure on the farmers to suffocate them, to pay them money not to produce food, to encourage them to give up farming, to sell their land, and so forth. That's coming. And I think that part of this is also this introduction of the digital euro, where, you might be penalized for not being vaccinated up to date, where they might impose quotas for consumption of meat, let's say animal protein. Well, they say you may eat 100 grams of meat per week, and then if you want to buy more, they cancel your transaction. And so they can do this with the programmable digital currencies. And so they're developing this. They're going to unroll it in October. But before everybody panics, we have to see what happens. Because they've already tried to do this in Nigeria in 2022, I think. And it failed miserably because it's a very, very, very complex project. It depends on people cooperating. And you know how it is with money. You can't have errors. If you go, you consult your bank account, it has to show the right balance. if you want to make a transaction, the transaction has to be conducted correctly, and correct amount has to be paid out, and the correct amount has to be debited from your account. And so whether the whole behemoth is going to function flawlessly is a big question, and I would say my confidence is very low. And so it's a big gamble on their part. I think that they've jumped the gun. They unrolled this much sooner than they are able to and prepared to. And I think it's more probable that it's going to be a disaster than that it will be a success. And in the end, I think that it'll be yet another nail in the coffin of the European Union, of the Euro, and also of NATO. And people and countries and regions and local communities will have to be prepared to become more self-reliant. And so that's the extremely important thing to do, is to be well acquainted with your local communities, to network with them, to know who can be of help, who can be of service, who can help you fix your car, who grows food, who has chickens and eggs and milk and so forth. And then, as it always happens through human history, you might have a season or a year or a few years of crisis. But if these local networks are functional and viable, then people can bridge the crisis, they can weather it and come out on the other side intact.
Yeah, with increasing discussions about blockchain and digital currencies, we talked over here. Do you see decentralized systems like Bitcoin, or some other forms disrupting traditional commodities trading?
Yes, definitely, and I think that technologies like blockchain are going to prove extremely important. I think one of the obvious gateways to escape the matrix is Bitcoin, but there are others. There's informal exchange networks where you can use whatever as a currency. People have used packs of cigarettes as currency. People have used locally printed tokens as currencies. Time banks are something that's extremely useful, where people simply contribute their time and gain credit that they can use to help themselves to other people's time. So all of these solutions exist. They are always decentralized because they emerge from the bottom up, and blockchain is only an added venue, an added alternative in that sense, because even in the crisis during the 1920s and 1930s, these, let's say, local and regional currencies sprang up like mushrooms in local communities, because people simply need to be able to exchange. They need to be able to transact, because maybe I grow potatoes, but if I have a ton of potatoes, what do I do with them? There are other people in my community who need the potatoes, while I need, milk or carrots or eggs, and I know that there are other neighbors who have those things. So we need to be able to exchange them, and people are very, very quick to improvise solutions. So those things just like spring up from the bottom up, and the solutions are created. So that's going to happen this time around as well, probably. But I think that the best thing would be if we didn't have to even deal with these situations. If we could avoid these disruptions altogether. But that's unfortunately it's going to take time, and we'll find out.
Yeah, Alex, let's talk a bit about censorship, narrative control, and social media. You have experienced censorship with your book, The Grand Deception, I believe is the name. How do you see the current state of the free speech and narrative control evolving, particularly with the role of social media in countering establishment narratives?
Well, look, I keep experiencing censorship in one way or another. In 2017, they banned my book, which was about, the coming war between Russia and the West. Then in 2021 or 22, they completely canceled my Amazon account. Then last year, no, this year, in the beginning of this year, I got unbanked by one of my banks. They just blocked my account for a space of about 6 weeks. Now, just about 2 weeks ago, I learned that American Express completely blocked me. So, if anybody wanted to subscribe to any of my newsletters and pay by American Express, it doesn't go. And that tells you what they can do, because okay, so American Express hurts, but if the same is done by Visa and MasterCard, that would hurt even more. So we'll see. They have these means, but what's important to realize is that this is difficult for them because it's a lot of homework to identify someone and then to do the work of trying to silence them, because there's tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of us, and we're using more and more and more platforms. There's YouTube, then there's Rumble, then there's Rockfin, then there's BitChute. Then you have all these podcast platforms. You have Substack. You have Medium. You have these things like Telegram and Signal and so forth. And so it's very, very difficult for them to do sense, to control the narrative and to control the flow of information. So I think that what we have to do is we just have to continue speaking out. Some venue is always open, like if you can't deliver your word through YouTube or other means, well, there's X, right, which is pretty good so far. And so we just have to keep on speaking out, and they will fail, and they are failing. And I think that the reason why they're failing is because they, up until 20, 30 years ago, we were all depending on radio and TV and printed word, and they organize themselves to control these things, and then it's easy to identify somebody who is ruining and challenging your narrative, and you identify some Tucker Carlson and you have them fired. Okay, but what if there's 10,000 Tucker Carlsons? And even if your audience is 10 people, these 10 people will speak to a few of their acquaintances. So it's going to be more than 10 people. And we've seen that people are wise in the sense that they sense the sources from which they get meaningful information. And then they, again, like a collective blob, they slowly gravitate towards those sources and away from the sources where they sense that they're being lied to. And so if you look 30 years ago, CNN was the biggest thing. It was the most trusted name in news. Today, virtually everybody ignores CNN, and people go to, Joe Rogan and Jimmy Dore and Tucker Carlson and Triangle Investor and so forth. And I think that, to figure out a Triangle Investor and to try to punish Lucian Valkovic for doing his work, somebody has to do this. It's work, and there's a hell of a lot more of us than there is of them. So we win unless we give up. That's the only way we lose if we allow ourselves to be intimidated into silence. Then they win. But let's not do that, because if we do that, our children will be their slaves.
Again, good point. Alex, final topic, commodities. You're known as a commodity expert as well. Where do you see the value going forward? I mean, as a speculator, let's say I'm a speculator, I want to hear your opinion on what commodities are good investment in, let's say, mid-term, not short-term. and what are the good, where is the good value in the long run, of course.
Well, I'll just correct you slightly. I'm not really a commodities expert. I'm more a trend following expert. So I monitor trends in about 200 markets. And it seems to me that at the moment it's the metals that are moving, particularly precious metals like gold and silver. Platinum and palladium, which have been kind of dead for years now, have finally jolted upwards this year, which tells you that something's changing. So I think they're relatively cheap now compared to their let's call it historical norm, and they may have begun trending up. So I think maybe palladium and platinum will be a good investment. Same thing with copper, which is actually in a very volatile, very chaotic trend, but it's a trend nevertheless. And I think that trend will gain momentum because, the Europeans are going to be allocating hundreds of billions of dollars into armaments industry. It's going to require a lot of metal. And one of the main metals in all this, in all these military application, is copper. And then copper is easily tradable. Maybe steel is not so tradable. And then I think that energy is going to be moving as well. There's no sign of that yet. The prices of oil and gas have been mostly drifting downwards for the past 3 years. But I think that there's sign that maybe the price of oil has bottomed and that it's beginning slowly to move higher. And I think that that trend might in the medium term might pick up, and so energy prices might be very interested. Natural gas in the United States is pretty much along the all-time historic lows. It's below $3 per whatever it is, 100 British thermal units or 1,000 or 10,000 British thermal units. And the markets that are still very solidly dead are the agricultural commodities. Dead meaning, they're just kind of drifting from low to lower. So nothing much going on there. I believe that...
So you mean potash and fertilizer markets, those markets?
Yeah, you see, I wouldn't know how to trade those. That's if it's not in the futures market, I don't touch it. So I only trade markets that are exchanged on recognized futures exchanges, and they have a significant volume of trading. If there are markets that exist in recognized futures exchanges, but if the daily volume is 5 contracts, I don't even look at it. So I don't even have much to say about those markets, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's like uranium spot market.
Yeah, exactly. But because there's a lot of things you might want to own as preferable to cash, maybe potash, but there's a problem. You can't buy a bag of coffee and bring it home and say okay, this is my investment because the coffee prices are going to go up, so I'll be able to sell it higher. Because you have a storage problem, and then stuff can spoil, it can burn down, and so on. This is why I use futures markets, because you can just gain exposure to the price without having to actually move the real goods around. And so that's a viable way to hedge your savings against inflation, whereas trying to own the physical stuff is not practical, really. In that case, I think there's only a few things, and that's gold, silver, physical, Bitcoin, and if possible, a piece of agricultural land.
Yeah, that really makes sense. Alex, how can people reach out to you?
So I'm active on X. My handle is @NakedHedgie. I have two publications on Substack. One of them is for traders and investors. It's a daily trend following newsletter called iSystem iSystem Trend Compass. And then I have also a personal publication called Alex Krainer's Substack. So that's the three main things.
Alex, thank you very much for this discussion. I enjoyed it as always, and I look forward to host you again sometime soon.
Excellent. Always a pleasure, Lucian. Until then.